Okay, so for the next part, we are going to move on to our keynote speaker, who we're very happy to have here today. She graduated from Berkeley with a Ph.D. in 1981. She is the first woman to receive the Distinguished Engineering Alumni Award of the College of Engineering at UC Berkeley. She's also on the boards of the Coalition to Diversify Computing and the Berkeley Foundation of Opportunities in Information Technology at UC Berkeley. Please welcome Dr. Barbara Simons. Thank you.
Sheila said this wasn't a serious enough title, but sort of how I feel. I'm not used to giving these talks with slides because when Paul and I were co-conspirators here, we would just sit on the edge of a desk and just BS with people about what we were doing and why they should come into the field. But giving a keynote is intimidating, so I made slides. One of the things I'm going to talk about is tricks that work for me, and I hope will work for you too. Things, of course, have changed here. Like this building wasn't here when we were here, and I kind of got lost trying to get here. Which happens to me a lot. And of course, there are a lot more women faculty, and there's certainly a lot more support for women here than there was when we were here, and I'm really pleased to hear that. And I should also just say that I'm really touched that you invited me to speak here. I mean, this means a lot to me, so thank you. So one of the first rules I learned after, well, when I was married to my first husband, who at one point was chairman of the math department at Stony Brook, was that any human-made rule can be broken. And that's something he did routinely. I was a fairly quick learner, so this served me well as a graduate student because, for one thing, I was a very non-standard graduate student, which was not unusual in those days. A lot of the PhD students were older women or got into the PhD program through a somewhat circuitous route. So I broke a lot of rules. I encourage you to break rules too if they get in your way. Just remember, if they're not physical rules, they can be broken. Sometimes you need to be a little persistent. So, well, actually, I said I felt a failure at 29. I actually felt a failure at 26 because I was in my late 20s and was a wife and mother and didn't have any degrees, but it felt worse when I was 29. Although my marriage broke up around the time I turned 30. And when I went back to school at Stony Brook, it was kind of weird because I'd been pigeonholed as chairman's wife. And so, like, there was this, I took linear algebra when I went back to school, and the math professor who taught it kind of didn't recognize me. He said to a colleague, who was also a friend of mine, that there was this girl in his class who looked a lot like Barbara Simons. He couldn't imagine me being a student. Which I sort of couldn't either sometimes. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about how I almost didn't get my PhD as well. So I had this one step at a time program. When my marriage broke up, I was having dinner with my dad, and he said to me, well, it was clear I didn't have any gainful, I couldn't be employed gainfully. I mean, maybe be a salesperson, that was about it. I had no degrees. My marriage was broken up. I had 3 little kids, no job skills. And he said to me, Barbara, why don't you learn how to program? You like math. You should be good at it. And it's one of the very few times I listened to my father. And so I decided to take programming class. So I went back, and like that first quarter at Stony Brook, which is where I was living, I took linear algebra and intro CS. And I really liked computer science. I thought, you know, the nice thing about computer science compared to math is that if they give you a problem, you can solve it. I mean, I didn't know about NP completeness and stuff like that back then. You know, I just thought, you know, in intro CS, they give you problems. And if you understand programming languages, you can typically solve it. It was tough going back, though, because I'd been out of school for 9 years. I'd forgotten most of my math. Don't ask me questions about calculus. I mean, I had it in high school, and going back, it was really kind of tough because I forgot a lot of it. But it was during when the women's movement was taking hold, and so I got a lot of support from other women when I was living in Stony Brook, and certainly when I came to Berkeley. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is that everyone is insecure. I mean, you saw from the title of my slide that I clearly was insecure, but everyone is insecure, even the guys. They just do a better job of hiding it. So that was quite an eye-opener for me. I also think that we women are harder on ourselves. We're more likely, if we make a mistake, to blame ourselves, whereas sometimes the guys will say, well, the professor didn't explain it right or something like that. So try not to internalize that. You know, I think women, and maybe it's changed. So remember, I was here 40 years ago. So maybe things are a lot better now, but when I was here, one of the reasons that we got involved with what we did was that we felt women weren't shooting high enough. We wanted more women to go to Berkeley as opposed to schools that weren't as prominent as Berkeley. And we felt that women tended to aim too low. So that was a concern we always had. I was afraid to speak up in class, which when I tell my friends now, they find kind of surprising because I speak up quite regularly. But when I was in my graduate courses, I was typically the only woman. And if I said something, like if the professor threw out a question, what do you think, you know, how do you do this, blah, 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 I would be afraid to answer because if I said something wrong, everybody would know it was me. Whereas I felt the guys had more anonymity. And I found that quite intimidating. What I didn't realize till after I got my PhD is that if you don't understand a problem, frequently other people don't either. I mean, this is a lesson I learned from my manager when I was at IBM Research, who would ask really dumb questions at talks. At least I thought they were really dumb. And then I realized his attitude was, if I don't understand it, they're not explaining it well. And there's no point in my sitting in this talk and not understanding it. So he would just, I mean, I thought they were dumb because I knew the answer. And so by definition, they were dumb questions. And you know, that's the wrong definition. So WICSE started, originally it was just WICSE, Women in Computer Science. The E was added for engineering as the group was expanded. We initially met just for weekly lunches, bag lunches once a week in what was the Commons Room in Evans Hall there, just to give each other support. But then Paula Hawthorne's boyfriend found out that there was university money available for student groups, which we were not. And we said, oh, why don't we get some of that money? Let's run a conference. So we decided to form a group. We had to be official, of course, so we needed officers. So we chose a somewhat unusual form of election. The first person to Sproul Hall to sign up was the president. The second was the vice president, and so on. So Paula became our first president. She got there first. And I think I was the first vice president. So we didn't know how to run a conference. And we thought, well, we'll just do something small. We'll ask for $600, and we got 60. And you know, looking back, if we had realized what the algorithm was, we would have asked for 6,000 and gotten 600. Around that time, we hooked up with Sheila Humphreys, who was at the Women's Center, and we worked with her on this conference, which occurred in 1978. And you've seen some pictures in the hall, and we do look a bit older. I noticed that. But we were really cute back then, I have to say. So Paula and I were going around, you know, so we wanted to raise, so we had this $60, right? So the faculty, we talked to some faculty, and they actually, in those days, like today, there was a lot of money in computer science. It sort of like was falling off the trees, and we were invited to a lunch, I remember, I don't know if Paula remembers, with funders for the department from different corporations, and we made a pitch for money for this conference. And they came through, and the College of Engineering pledged to match what we got. So we got $3,000 from the college, $3,000 from the funders. We had our $6,000, not 600, and we put on a conference. We filled the hall, Sproul Auditorium. Sheila thinks there were 800 people there. It was real. There were a lot of people. Room full of students. One of the other graduate students, one of the male graduate students came. Several of them came for the opening because Paula and I were this initial panel. There's a picture of us out there. And that was my Bella Abzug day with the hat. You know, you guys don't know who Bella Abzug was, but the older folks here do. And he said to us afterwards, I now understand what it's like for you to be in class, because he was surrounded by women, and if he spoke up, everybody would turn around to look at him, right? And in fact, that actually did happen to the dean when I made this comment. We've talked about how at the time there was one woman in the entire College of Engineering, in fact, one. And so I had these prepared remarks. I was pretty nervous about the speaking, so I had it all written out. And I said, as of the fall of this year, there was one woman faculty member. And he chimed out and he said, that's not true. And then I continued with my next line, which is said, we just doubled it to 2. And the audience burst into applause, and he didn't say another word. There were a number of things that happened because of that conference, including the admissions requirements were were modified to make them less hostile to women because of some of the requirements, some of the initial high school coursework that was required to get into the College of Engineering. And that was thanks to Professor Elizabeth Scott, who was chair of the STAC department, and another very interesting woman. She was, well, I'll tell you, she was going to be an astronomer, but they wouldn't let her use the telescope. So she became a statistician. Because she was a woman. They wouldn't let her use the telescope because she was a woman. She became a statistician and a staunch, lifelong feminist and very supportive of what we did. So after we got our PhDs, we sort of thought, well, you know, what's going to happen at the university? Because we were, you know, stirring things up here when we were here, and now we were gone. So we thought, well, we need a reentry program because a number of us had been older students and gone back to school. So, well, I guess I started IBM before my dissertation, but that's just, you know, I finished it, fortunately. So we got together, again, Paula, Sheila, and I got together, and I think Sheila probably did most of the writing of the proposal. We came up with a proposal for a reentry program for women and minorities in computer science. We had meetings with the faculty in the Commons Room again, and Paula and I went out and we spent money on sandwiches and wine. And that's another trick. If you want to try to convince the faculty to support you, buy them wine. It doesn't have to be very good, actually. You know. Well, maybe these days people are more discerning. Anyway, this program, what was interesting about this program was this was a time when computer science was super, super hot, and it was very hard to get seats in classes. So one of the main things that the reentry program did was it provided seats in classes for the returning students. We didn't give them any certificate, no guarantee of entry to graduate school. We wanted them to get the coursework they needed so they could apply to top graduate schools in the country, including, of course, Berkeley. I've said some of this. Oh yes, the faculty really loved the students. I mean, initially there was some of the faculty weren't so sure about this, but once the program got going, they loved the students because they were older, more mature, and they were there because they wanted to be there. And they added a different dimension to the experience. There are several PhDs that have been produced that we are very proud of. Unfortunately, the program was killed because of the Anti-Affirmative Action Prop 209. And I've got a little note there, politics matter, and I'm going to talk about that again briefly at the end. I mean, what happens around you doesn't impact you, it impacted us. So, after I got my PhD, I was ready to retire. Because to me, I couldn't imagine anything more glorious than getting a PhD from Berkeley. I mean, that was like the pinnacle. Because when I started off, I wasn't thinking, when I went back to school with 3 little kids and no undergraduate degree and said, I'm going to get a PhD from UC Berkeley in computer science, I never would have done it. Never. So my dad said, learn to program. I said, okay, I can take a programming class. And then, you know, I gradually continued, and in those early days, computer science wasn't nearly as rich an area, a field as it is today. And Stony Brook was not a huge department, so within a few years I was doing graduate work. I was taking graduate level. I mean, compilers and operating systems and compilers were graduate classes back then, if you can believe it, at least in Stony Brook. So I was taking graduate courses, and someone said, you're doing the master's work, but you're not matriculating, so I applied for admission to the master's program and was admitted. I was there for a year, and then, I don't know if I've got more slides that say this. If I do, I'm going to have to skip them. So I was there for a year, and then I transferred to Berkeley, and eventually got into the PhD program. I transferred. I applied after the deadline, so my first quarter here. Mike Harrison let me take his formal language theory class, and then I was also teaching Intro to CS for night school at Berkeley. So I had to teach BASIC, which of course I didn't know, so I had to learn BASIC. It was an interesting experience. Anyway, let me see. Do I talk about how I got my? All right. Should I talk about how I got my PhD? Yeah, I think I have time. So when I went to get my PhD, so I had part of my dissertation finished, and I went to IBM Research because actually Manuel encouraged me to do that, and I finished it while I was there, and then I went to get my my PhD. I had to get the title page for my dissertation, so I went to Sproul Hall. And I asked for the title page, and it said on the title page that I had a master's degree from Stony Brook, which I didn't, because I just never finished the master's work at Stony Brook. I just transferred to Berkeley and skipped it. So I said, stupidly, no, I don't. So they said, oh, we'll have to redo the title page. So, okay. I went back to IBM, nothing happened, nothing happened. Mike Harrison was my major field advisor. Dick Karp was my dissertation advisor. So finally I called Dick, and he called Sproul Hall and said, what's with this? They said, well, she can't get her title page. She didn't meet the admissions requirements. So we all thought that was a little bit silly, because presumably admissions requirements are there to determine if you can do the work, and I'd already written my dissertation. Dick discovered that you could get a master's degree from Berkeley by taking an exam, which nobody was doing in those days. So I had a virtual exam. My daughter, who was also a student at Berkeley when I was, suggested that one of the questions should be under what star were you born, but I don't know if it was or not, because the exam really never took place. But it satisfied the bureaucrats. They gave me my title page. I got my Ph.D. I wanted to give the master's degree back because I didn't feel I earned it, and my mother said, don't you dare, because she had waited till I was 41 for me to get anything aside from a high school diploma. So I still have the master's degree that I really don't feel I earned. So my area of my dissertation was in computer science theory, and I did learn about NP completeness, of course. And I spent many years doing that at IBM Research, but remember, I was an older student, and I think frequently older students come with a greater variety, a broader life experience, and I was always very interested in policy and politics. And one of the things I learned early on because of my interest in that area is don't call it ethics. I don't care what you think about ethical behavior. Don't call it ethics because that's female, soft. Call it policy. Policy's male, hard. And so what I do is policy, which it really is now, actually. But back then, when there are also ethical questions about how are you going to use this technology, and I think some of those are very serious questions. But if it's labeled ethics, I think it's not taken seriously. At least that's my view. Language matters. So computing is, of course, in all areas of life, in all areas of politics, in all areas of government. Privacy is an example. A major example, security, surveillance, intellectual property, because we can use digital rights management to prevent access to intellectual property that is allowed by law. So that's a major issue. Domain names, the use of domain names. Should you be able to have a website that says IBM sucks, for example? Should be able to have a website that says that? Well, IBM may think you shouldn't, because they have a trademark of the name. So there are all kinds of interesting questions. And if anybody wants to talk to me about any of these policy issues, I'm going to be here all day, happy to talk to you about them. So I got involved with ACM. It has many opportunities for volunteers. As you can see, I've met a lot of interesting people. And it also provided an outlet for me to do some of the stuff I wanted to do. For example, I was invited to, because of my interest in policy, I was invited to chair the Technology Policy Committee at ACM I guess shortly after I got my Ph.D. And I didn't realize at the time that it was a minefield because it had been created by somebody whose main interest was helping Russian refuseniks get to the US. And I wanted to deal with other issues as well. And so that created a lot of political problems, things that I learned about over time. Anyway, over time, I was elected ACM secretary. And that at the time was one of the 3 positions. I would say national, but actually ACM is international. And I was being groomed to be the next president. However, my top-level manager at IBM sort of didn't think that I should do that. Now, one question I've always had, what if you had a different attitude if I were male? I don't know. So I didn't do that. Instead, I became the founder and the first chair of the US Public Policy Committee of ACM, which still exists today. It's called USACM. In fact, I'm flying to Washington next week for a meeting. So the ACM charter is kind of interesting. It forbids lobbying explicitly. So when we do policy at ACM, we don't lobby, we educate, right? But it's interesting that it was written into the bylaws of the organization. My theory is that that's because of McCarthyism. That there were, under McCarthy, there were a lot of attacks not only on entertainers but on scientists and intellectuals of all sorts. And I think this was done in response to that, but I don't know for sure. Anyway, I ultimately took early retirement for IBM and became ACM president for a couple of years. Let's see. So that opened a lot of doors. So having a PhD from Berkeley opens a lot of doors, and being ACM president does too. It was a very good experience because I actually did it full time, which is very unusual. Most ACM presidents are gainfully employed. I wasn't. So one of the things I learned is another lesson. If you want to accomplish something, if you want to convince people to do something, try listening to them. So when I was running the U.S. Public Policy Committee of ACM, at one point, just after I was president, total information awareness came out. I know some of you remember that. This was like a massive surveillance program, and I wanted to fight it. And we actually were the only professional society to issue a statement about it, and we focused on the technological issues, all the issues of the surveillance and the privacy that was involved with that. But I spent a month calling people and emailing people to get support. And there were people who didn't support it, but who didn't speak out against me because they felt they were listened to. And I think this is a very valuable lesson in life. And certainly if you are trying to accomplish anything that involves convincing other people to do what you want them to do, which I do a lot. As I say, these skills transfer to other areas. How I became obsessed with voting. What I do now, what I've done for over the past decade, is I've been working on on fighting the improper use of computers in voting. And we have that in spades in this country. It's very, very serious and dangerous. I got involved in a major way. Well, I first got involved when I was invited because I had my ACM president's hat on. I was invited to be on a panel that was looking at internet voting for the country. It was sponsored by the National Research Council at President Clinton's request. And I went into that thinking, wow, this sounds really cool. Of course, internet voting is a great idea. And then I talked to a few computer security people, and I came out of that panel thinking, oh my God, this is really terrible. We should not be doing internet voting, and that's still the case today. But anyway, then in 2003, I was living in Palo Alto at the time, and I learned that Silicon Valley was about to buy paperless voting machines. I mean, these things are computers, and they're paperless. And anybody who's done serious programming knows this is a bad idea. But trying to explain to election officials that this is a bad idea was really hard, because the vendors came in and said it's completely secure, don't worry. And not only that, the election officials want to believe, they want to believe, because at the end of the day, they could push a button and get the results, go home. So this is what we were encountering back in the early 2000s. We, computer scientists, naively thought, well, we'll just go and explain the issues to them. You know, we've got PhDs in computer science from major universities. We know what's going on. We'll just explain. People will listen to us. They'll do the right thing. Well, you see how well that's worked in climate science? We had the same kind of experience. People who don't want to hear what you have to say are going to work very hard not to hear it. And I mean, they would say, well, you may know about computers, but we know about elections. So you computer scientists, okay, but we can protect everything because we know about these elections that are all around the computers. And they have no idea that they can't. They don't, I mean, it's gotten better, but this is what it was like in the beginning in many cases. And this is another issue. I know I'm digressing a lot, but one of the problems in our society is that most of the policymakers in this country come out of liberal arts, right? A lot of lawyers and English majors, you know, they come out of liberal arts. They don't have a good grasp, in many cases, of science and technology and engineering. And they are making our laws, and they are making our policy, and they are, in the case of voting, a lot of them are election officials. So this is a difficulty that anybody who cares about what happens to this country and has the kind of knowledge that you guys have is going to confront. And you should just be aware of it and try to, you know, we've got to figure out the best way to get our message out that people who don't have the training that we have can understand. Anyway, verified voting was formed around that time, primarily by computer science PhDs, actually. It was started by David Dill, who was a Stanford computer science professor, and I was on the first board, and I've been on the board ever since. So again, I don't want to spend too much more time on elections, but they are shockingly vulnerable. There are 5 states that are totally paperless still, Georgia being one of them, and I don't know how many of you followed the John Ossoff race last year. $50 million was spent on that race, and the entire race in the entire state votes on Diebold paperless touchscreen voting machines that we've known how to hack since 2007. And in fact, one of our advisory board members, Alex Halderman, has a very nice hacking, how much time do I have? No? Okay, never mind. Has a very nice hacking demo showing how to remotely access, okay, how to remotely access these machines and change all the votes if he wants to. This is what Georgia is voting on today. This is what the 2018 midterm is going to be on. This is what people spent $50 million on a special race, and nobody can verify that the results were correct. You cannot do a recount on these machines. 83% of Pennsylvania is entirely paperless. That was one of the swing states. That was one of the states in 2016. There was actually an effort to do a recount in Pennsylvania. It would have been impossible because you can't, I mean, you can recount the paper part, the 17% that's paper, but the 83% that's paperless, you can't. These machines are all vulnerable to hacking, and again, there's this myth that if the voting machines are not connected to the internet, that they're secure. As you've seen with Stuxnet, I don't know how many of you followed Stuxnet. That was the virus that brought down the Iranian centrifuges. It was not; those centrifuges were not connected to the internet, but they were brought down by the Stuxnet virus, and you can do that with voting. We've got scanners. Here, I'm sure in Berkeley you use what we use in San Francisco. You put your paper ballot into a scanner. That is also a computer. That can also be hacked or can have malware in it. So we are using computers almost everywhere in our elections. And as computer scientists, as people understand computers, we have to make sure they're used correctly. And that's a sort of a general theme. That's the case for privacy, for surveillance, for all of these areas. Computers can be used well, or they can be used incorrectly. I mean, we were accused of being Luddites, which is kind of funny because the opposition was coming from computer scientists initially. We're not Luddites. I'm online all day long. Anyway, so, and one final note, blockchains don't solve the problem. No. So a couple final thoughts. So I've already talked a little bit about the threats to the midterms. And then I want to talk about, just really quickly, an early life lesson that I learned. I was born, this is embarrassing, well, I was born before Pearl Harbor. I was an infant during World War II. At a young age, I started reading books about the Holocaust. I read books that I would not want my children to have read at the age that I read them. They were pretty awful. I mean, graphic descriptions of what happened in concentration camps that probably are not available today, but I read them probably before I was a teenager. And they've had an impact on me for my whole life. And the lesson I took away as a young girl was that politics can kill you. And I think to some extent we're starting to see that today too, in some very disturbing ways. So what I want you to do is, in spite of my talking about all these important non-study issues, focus on your studies. Get your degrees. It's really important. It's important for you to succeed at what you're doing. We need, as women, even today, it's important to be credentialed. You're still more likely to be questioned than a guy. If you've got a Ph.D. from Berkeley, that says a huge amount. It's really valuable. Don't get distracted, even though I'm trying to distract you with the stuff I'm doing. Don't get distracted. Focus on your work. That's really critical. But don't ignore the world around you. Be aware of what's going on. And where appropriate, speak up. Just don't spend too much time doing it like I did. Think about the implications of what you do. Because most technology has implications. And it's, in my opinion, not enough to say, well, I just make the technology, what's done with it is none of my business. It is your business. It's all of our business. And we are all very privileged to be here at Berkeley. I know I was incredibly privileged, and I still feel extremely so. So finally, questions and comments. Thank you. I hope this is a good time.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for such a all-encompassing and inspiring talk. I mean, a lot of the stuff I kind of know, but I like to hear it over again every once in a while to inspire me. My question is, there was a comment on your slide about the Evans Hall bathroom incident that wasn't quite covered, so I was just hoping maybe you'd kind of talk about that.
Okay. Sorry, I kind of skipped through stuff. So Evans Hall, that's, again, Elizabeth Scott. So when Evans Hall was built, the committee, and I think were you guys involved? Lenore and Manuel? Well, my understanding is the original proposal had women's bathrooms only on every other floor because they didn't think there'd be that many women in Evans Hall. And Elizabeth Scott said, no way. She was on the building committee. You have a women's bathroom on every single floor in Evans Hall. I think over in Corey they still don't, right? They didn't when I was here. That one of the bathrooms was labeled women faculty? Is that still? Not anymore. That was so weird. Questions?
Hi, I'm Laura Brink. I'm a second-year PhD student. I wanted to ask you, if you could change one policy, what would it be?
Oh, well, I guess given how terrified I am of what's happening with elections, I would have secure voting technology at this point, because everything depends on who gets elected. Questions?
Hello, hi, Geeta Swami. I got my PhD from Berkeley. Sheila reminded me that I should introduce myself. The whole issue of voting technology, secure voting technology, the issue is more a political one, not a technological one, right? I mean, I invited David Dill over to India when we started looking at the problem back in 2001. And, you know, eventually now the Election Commission has just ordered that, or has been ordered by the government and the Supreme Court, that all the voting machines should be voter verified. Very much in the nature, you know, with a voter verified paper trail, very much in the nature that you do it with an ATM. It's the same problem. So not so much the technological issue. There is a solution. It's called a paper backup anyway. But the political issue of getting governments to agree to do it.
Well, unfortunately, voting has become politicized, but it shouldn't have been. It really is a technological issue, because these initial machines that were purchased in the United States were terribly engineered. I mean, not only were they paperless, but like all of the independent testing that's been done by people who know what they're doing have found major security problems with it. Frequently, passwords are hardwired. Sometimes they're ABCDE. I mean, hardwired. You know, there are keys that are used for debug machine, the kind of key that works for all. There's one key that works for all of them, and you can buy it anywhere. It's used in hotel bars. Frequently use the same key. You can open it up, take out the memory card, and put in a new memory card as an example of the kind of thing you can do. So they were badly engineered. There were no standards, and the standards still are insufficient. But there is actually technology. For example, what we need are paper ballots, not trails, because what you're talking about, like the ATM, people often don't check those. What we've learned from studies. Do you fill out a ballot?
Yeah, that's the Indian system that they have mandated, is that you basically put it in electronically. It comes with electronically. It gives you a paper.
It prints out.
It prints out. You take it out from the machine, look at it, and you put in a separate.
And what is counted?
What is counted is the electronic, except when there's a dispute, and then you pull out the audit box.
Yeah. Okay. So that's still not sufficient, because of course the electronic could be wrong. So right, but there has to be a dispute. That's not the right policy. You should not depend on politicians or anybody to get these machines checked. They should be checked automatically. That should be the law. So what we need are paper ballots and what are called risk-limiting audits. Risk-limiting audits, and this is technology, were developed by Philip Stark, who at the time was chair of the stat department here at Berkeley. He's now an associate dean. He's the first statistician to look at the question of how can you use statistics to check on the computers without avoiding a full manual recount in most cases. And you know, I can talk a little bit about what risk-limiting audits are, but I don't want to keep people from lunch. But basically, it's elementary statistics, which doesn't mean that I understand it, but it's elementary statistics. And the idea is there are two main variables: how close is the race, and how much confidence do you want to have in the result. And the closer the race, the more ballots you have to look at. And then there are ways of escalating if you start finding problems with the ballots. And what I feel and what my colleagues all feel is there should be ballots that the voter marks, and the computers should always be checked. It should not, Al Gore shouldn't have had to say anything, Hillary Clinton should have had to say anything. There should have been paper ballots everywhere, and they should have been checked. So.
Barbara, thank you so much for a beautiful talk. I would like to turn a little bit to the personal. When you mentioned you were in your PhD program, you had 3 small children, and PhD programs are incredibly demanding. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you managed that, how you were successful in such a challenging circumstance, because little children take a lot of time and care, and how that might translate to professional women more generally, and sort of how to think about family issues and work issues, and how to be still successful.
Well, I had advantages that a lot of women in my situation don't have. I mean, it was harder for Paula, and I hope Paula Hawthorne, who also had 2 children, and I think hope she'll talk about how she coped with that. But in my case, when my husband and I first separated, money was not an issue for us. I mean, he was not miserly with money. He never has been. And so I was living in a house with the kids, and I ended up actually renting a room to another woman. And she would, so like when I had to go to the computing center, back in those days, you had to go physically to the computing center. And you had to wait an hour for to get your stuff back. And if you missed, if you had a comma wrong, you have to put it back in again. I mean, it was, we had cards. It was pretty primitive, and by today's standards anyway. And so I could leave the house after the kids went to bed, and there was somebody there. That's an option that other women may not have. And then my first year at Berkeley, my still husband, but separated, was going to Geneva. He's a mathematician, or he was then, and I said, why don't you take the kids? And so he went there for a year, he took the kids, and my first year at Berkeley, I was here without kids. And that actually made it easier. I mean, I spent the summers with them, but from then on, one by one, they came out to live with me. My daughter came out, as I said, she was at Berkeley. We were both students at Berkeley at the same time, which was kind of cool. But I had advantages that a lot of other women don't have. So it's hard. And I think, as I say, Paula's situation is probably more representative. Any other questions? No? So if you've got, oh yeah, Sheila.
I just wanted to make a comment because, and Paul will talk later in the day, I think, a little bit about the reentry program, but it's a wonderful surprise, to me anyway, that Manuel Blum is here with Lenore Blum. And for students who are current, they probably don't know that Manuel was a member of our faculty for many years. He's now at Carnegie Mellon, as is Lenore Blum, where she's initiated and developed a huge program for women. But Manuel was the chairman, the very generous and beloved chairman who enabled the reentry program to go forward. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to Manuel and to Lenore.
Thanks, Sheila.
I have a final question, if that's okay. So I want to go back to something you talked about earlier, where you were talking about how a lot of women are sort of afraid to speak up in like sort of group environments, and this is very relatable. I've struggled with this for like more than 10 years, and I was curious as to whether you have constructive suggestions about how to overcome that, because it's something I've known that I should not be afraid to speak up, but I've just struggled with it. So I'm curious to hear what you think.
That's a good question. Like I say, in my case, I didn't get over it till I got my Ph.D. and observed my manager at IBM speaking up and asking, as I say, what I thought were stupid questions. By definition, they were stupid because I knew the answers. And then I realized, hey, he can do it, I can do it too. That doesn't help you or any other people particularly. One thing that, I don't know, I mean, this is really weird, but when I was a kid, I took dramatic lessons, and I loved to act. And that's actually helped me with public speaking. I don't know if it helps with speaking up, but it helps with public speaking. And I know there are programs for people to do, what are they, there are various clubs you can join where people do stuff. I don't know the names, but I see people nodding. Toastmaster, right. So that's not quite the same thing as, I was Peter Rabbit at 6, so that's not the same thing as Toastmaster, and I had great ears. By my grandmother. But something like that I think may help, because then you get the experience of speaking up in a non-threatening environment. Well, I'm going to be here all day, and I'd love to talk with you guys about what you're doing, and I can talk more about what I'm doing, and Oh, yes, there's a question back there. No, not a question.